Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate and today I'm going to be doing my best of the year for 2024. I have previously done my worst of the year and I did a live sort of battle of the books for my honorable mentions, so we have boiled it back down to my absolute favorites of 2024. I did limit myself to one book per author or series. Otherwise, there might have been some other ones in here. And I did force myself to get it down to 10 because I knew I was going to do my honorable mentions video. So I will say that the top three on this list are solid. They're definitely the top three. The others could vary from day to day, but I forced myself to give a ranking, at least for today. This is the ordering of my top 10. Okay, so number 10 on my list is a familiar name if you watched my honorable mentions, and that is The Affair of the Mysterious Letter by Alexis Hall. Ooh, I'll try not to flash that. This is a sort of fantasy mystery blend that combines sort of a take on Sherlock Holmes along with Lovecraftian elements. So there's definitely some familiar names and places in this if you're familiar at all with Lovecraft stuff. But it follows the Watson stand-in is Captain John Wyndham, who has just recently returned from war with this sort of unfathomable sorceress and is looking for a place to stay and ends up staying with a consulting sorceress, Scheherazade Oz, who's just kind of standard Sherlock except a woman this time. So definitely using drugs, super prickly, very smart, but definitely gets up to some trouble because she's so smart. And the whole thing is told from a somewhat rambly, snarky perspective. I absolutely get why this has such mixed reviews, but it's absolutely 100% a Kate book. I loved the mystery elements of it. It has that classic sort of detective mystery feel to it, and I absolutely loved all of the nods to Lovecraft things. I really enjoyed the audiobook, which is narrated by Nicholas Bolton, and it was just, he goes kind of over the top with all these different voices, and it was just so much fun. Like, I would not have expected this to end up in my top 10, but it's one of those reads that I just had such a fantastic time start to finish that I couldn't not put it on here, because genuinely I could pick this up today and just listen to it and have a great time. So I feel like it stands out to me mostly because it was such a fun reading experience and one of the few fantasy mystery blends that actually works well for me. I often feel like it lets me down on either the fantasy or the mystery side, and this is very different from the other fantasy mystery blend that's going to be on this list that you could probably guess because it's on a lot of lists. So number 9 is Echoes of the Imperium by Nicholas Atwater and Olivia Atwater. Olivia Atwater is most well known for her Half a Soul Regency fairy tales series. This is co-written with Olivia and her husband Nicholas, and it is such an interesting mix to me because you can see the influence of the capricious fae and magic that is familiar from Olivia's writing, but then it's so much more of a sort of swashbuckling fantasy adventure, much more action focused than Olivia's series. So this story follows a goblin captain of an airship, and he has this ragtag crew that he's sort of brought together over the years, and they end up getting dragged into these bigger political machinations because there was an oppressive empire that used to run everything in this world, and it has been overthrown, and now there's sort of a power vacuum that people are fighting over, and they kind of get dragged into this all these intrigues surrounding who's going to take charge now. It really dives much more deeply into the fae and the steampunk elements than the prequel novella, A Matter of Execution, did. I would still probably recommend reading the novella first, but you don't have to. It's just a good introduction to the characters. And then they really build on the characters in this one. And I absolutely loved all of them. I loved the different arcs you got to see. I think despite being very much a swashbuckling adventure, this also has a lot of heart to it. There's a lot of conversation around redemption and how to make up for having been part of this empire. There's a lot of conversation around classism and different power levels and what's an appropriate use of power. I keep talking about this being a fun time. There is also major themes around grief and loss in this one pretty early on in the story, so it's very much bittersweet in terms of being very fun adventure story but also tackling these heavier themes. So don't go in thinking it's just a fun time, but if you like high action adventure, I would highly recommend this one. I know Nicholas is the one who narrates the audiobook for the prequel novella, and they are working on the audiobook for this book. It's not out yet, but I would definitely keep an eye out for it because his narration made the novella even more fun to me, so I will definitely be snapping up the audiobook once that's out. Number 8 on my list is a familiar name, and I am kind of cheating because I said I wasn't repeating authors, but I feel like Olivia Atwater by herself is slightly different from Nicholas and Olivia Atwater together. So I know it's a cheat, but I'm doing it anyway. It's my list. I do what I want. But anyway, this is The Witchwood Knot by Olivia Atwater. It is the first book in her Victorian fairy tales series, which takes place a little bit, I want to say it's like 10 years maybe, after the events of the Regency fairy tale series. You don't have to have read the Regency fairy tale series in order to enjoy this one and understand what's happening. I liked knowing at least some of the side characters that come up again from Half a Soul in particular. But again, it's not necessary. You can jump straight into this one if you want. I will say that if you have read the Regency fairy tale series, this one takes place, it is in the Victorian time period. It's a lot darker in tone than the Regency fairy tale series, which especially Half a Soul had more of like a whimsical note to it. This is quite a bit darker and delves into some of the workhouses and some of the nastier parts of the relationships between the nobility and the working class in England in the time period. So just know going in, it's quite a bit darker. This story follows a governess who, due to a promise that she made to an old family friend, ends up traveling to a remote manor to take care of a bratty kid who lives in this noble manor. So this manor is being haunted by the Fae, and so the governess is going to have to handle that, as well as the lord who does not believe in fairies whatsoever. So there's an interesting element between the different classes, like I said, in this one. There's a lot of conversation on power and how inherently women in this time period have to navigate that power structure, especially when they're from different classes. And it still has that same element of the capricious Fae bargains that her previous series has. And I really enjoyed sort of the darker tone of this. Again, I loved the Regency fairy tale series. And I will say that reading this made me go back and reread Half a Soul and then catch up on that series so that I could understand where it had ended and then pick up with this one. But again, not necessary. I enjoyed this so much that it made me want to go back and read those others. But if you like Fae bargains, and if you like particularly a darker tone with some social commentary, I would highly recommend this one. And then number 7 was a total shock for me. This is one that I referenced when I was talking about the honorable mentions, and I think even my worst books of the year, where I was saying that sometimes you pick up a trope that almost never works for you, and somehow the author just manages to make that work. And for me, that was The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This was amazing. I normally am an extremely hard sell on any kind of time travel, time loops, multiple dimensions type story. It's really just not my thing. But this one I absolutely loved from the very beginning. First off, I will say that Johnson's prose is beautiful. Prose isn't normally something I go out looking for. I don't necessarily need it in a story to enjoy it, but I really liked her writing style, and I ended up highlighting a lot of this just because I really like the way that she phrases sentences, and the way she handles themes in this is just gorgeous. The story follows Kara, who has died in a bunch of different worlds, and essentially that allows her to work for this company that has people hopping different dimensions to collect information about all the different realities. But it's so much more focused on the thematic elements. Again, this is something that really gets into class and power differences, and not only those themes, but also delves into Kara's character and how different changes in the various ways that she's raised in the different dimensions change who she ends up being and what she ends up valuing and where she ends up fitting into society. And I thought that was such an interesting thing to explore. Like, normally that would have confused and frustrated me to have all these different realities that get mentioned, but it explores it with Kara in this very character driven way that made it easy for me to follow along with, and also made it really compelling for me. And I think because this was so character focused and not at all focused on the mechanics of the dimension hopping, it worked for me in a way that a lot of other stories wouldn't have. So I would highly recommend checking this one out. I know for some folks it's a little too focused on the themes and a little, some people feel like it's a little more on the literary side, and I get that. But I will say, as someone who typically doesn't enjoy literary sci-fi, I thought this was amazing. So I would highly recommend checking it out. And I do plan on picking up the sequel that just came out last year for that one. I think it's called Those Beyond the Wall, in 2025. So I definitely want to catch up with that before I have too much time in between them. Number 6 is another one that's not necessarily a surprise, but I am kind of surprised that a novella can compete with some of the other books that I have on this list. I don't always expect it to deliver on the same level as a novel. But this one, Mammoths at the Gates by Nghi, definitely did for me. And this is the 4th book in the Singing Hills cycle by Vo, which follows a cleric who basically wanders around collecting stories from people. Editing Kate here because I did a terrible job of explaining the synopsis for this one, so tip number 2 on that. This particular installment follows Cleric Nghi as they travel home to the Singing Hills Abbey to deal with the aftermath of the death of their mentor, who has been leading the Abbey, and not only the funeral arrangements that need to happen, as well as sort of the grief ceremonies, but also dealing with the Mammoth riders that have ties to their mentor and are demanding the mentor's body be returned back to them. There's this very bittersweet exploration of what it's like to come home as an adult, where you have changed, but also the people at home have changed, and how you kind of fit back into that. I really liked getting to see more of the Nyshen, which are these talking birds that accompany the clerics and have their own sort of power structure. And I also really liked that exploration of grief and memory, because this mentor meant different things to different people, and the way they remember this person who was important to their lives is very different. So I really loved that exploration and was really impressed at how Vo could make me feel so many emotions for such a short page length. This continues to be one of my favorite series. I will pick up literally every installment. Not every installment ends up on my best of the year, but Mammoths at the Gates certainly did. Number 5 was actually my last book that I read in 2024, so I'll admit to there being a little bit of recency bias in this one, but it was almost guaranteed to be on that list anyway, and that is Emily Wilde and the Map of the Otherlands, the second book in the Emily Wilde series by Heather Fawcett. This follows the further adventures of the fairy scholar Emily Wilde, and I can't get too much into the plot of this one because I don't want to spoil things for anybody who hasn't read the first book. It is a super hyped series, so odds are you're pretty familiar with it, but I don't want to get spoilery here. I like this a lot. I would have guessed that this would end up further up on my list, and part of the reason that it's not is that I just read books that blew me away even more. But I think the other reason is that really the strength of Map of the Otherlands is in the character growth and getting to see some of these relationships in Emily's life develop. It has a little bit less of a found family vibe than the previous book did because you don't have the same feel of the village growing to know Emily and treasure her and sort of that reciprocal understanding between them. But you do get to see some other people in Emily's life kind of gathering around her, and I appreciate that this series keeps showing Emily finding that spot for herself in other people's lives, even though she is very much a prickly, difficult person to get to know and become close to, because she has all of these walls but also just reacts differently. And I think it's handled in a much better way than I have seen some other books, which have been worst of the year, previous years. I think the plot for this is not as good to me as the first book, but I still really enjoyed seeing all of these characters again. I enjoyed seeing the different kinds of fae that you get to see in this one, and I'm very intrigued about where Fawcett is going to go with the third book, because it feels like it's going to need to have a different tone than these last two have had, just based on where this leaves off. So I'll be really interested to see what happens from here. I don't know that Fawcett is necessarily an auto-buy author for me, but certainly anything having to do with Emily, I will snap up immediately. I will say that that book was one that it took me literally all year to get around to reading because I was so scared that it would let me down because it was so hyped. And I had such high expectations after having read the first book multiple times, but it really did live up to what I was hoping for from it. Number 4 on my list is another one from a favorite author, and this one really surprised me because when I initially picked it up, I read like the first chapter and it was so much darker than I was expecting that I ended up setting it down and then having to circle back to it later in the year. And that is A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. Man, I love this book so much. And it's so surprising to me because it is so much darker than Kingfisher's other books that I have read. I've read almost everything she's written at this point. I think there's maybe 4 of her books that I haven't gotten to. I know one of them is Nettle and Bone. We'll not speak about that. Maybe someday I'll get to it again. But this is such a perfect blend of dark fantasy and somewhat horror elements with this lighter found family, almost Regency romance element to it. And I just loved it, start to finish. Once I knew what I was getting into and I realized that it was going to be a sort of darker tone to the story, I absolutely loved every second of it. I should actually give you a synopsis for this before I keep gushing about it. So, the story follows Cordelia, who is the daughter of a very dangerous sorceress who has basically decided that she's going to marry into high society, and she sets her sights on this sort of, I think he's a squire, local nobleman, not super high up, but enough for her purposes. You follow Cordelia's point of view as someone who's basically been manipulated by her mother her entire life, and I think she's in her teens, if I remember right. And then you also follow Hester, who is the sister of this squire and is just the snarkiest, most relatable middle-aged woman. I absolutely adored her. She was a highlight. Like, I loved Cordelia too. Cordelia definitely wrapped herself around my heart, but Hester just made me laugh so often. I just really loved the snark level of her, and I loved the way that Hester and her friends kind of made this found family around Cordelia, and were trying to help find a way to deal with this sorceress who is so powerful when they are just normal people. I will say there is an element of animal cruelty in this. So, as someone who normally can't handle that, I will say it was a little bit difficult, but it's set up in a way that made it more bearable for me. I also normally hate geese, I will admit, but the geese in this were so precious. Man, I love them so much. Props to T. Kingfisher for actually making me like geese in this story. This is my new favorite from T. Kingfisher. I have loved almost everything she's written, but this has the greatest sense of threat and sort of the darkest tone to it, but also just is so ultimately hopeful and adorable. I just absolutely loved what T. Kingfisher accomplished in this one. Okay, so now we are getting to my top 3, and these are, without a doubt, the best 3 books that I have read all year. I would rank these in exactly this order, regardless of what day you asked me on. So these, for sure, my absolute favorites. And the first is, no surprise, based on my comments earlier, and that is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. So I had picked up, I think, his City series. I can't right now think of the name of the first one. But I picked those up and I liked it, but I never actually finished that series. So I wasn't sure how I would feel about this. And again, like I said, when I was talking about the affair of the mysterious letter, I am frequently dissatisfied with mystery genre blends because it's either mostly fantasy or it's mostly mystery, but often the mystery is done in a way that I don't particularly care for. And this was exactly the kind of detective murder mystery story that I love, paired with a fully developed fantasy world that I was just fascinated by. It essentially has elements of fungal horror and dark fantasy. I know I've heard it compared to Attack on Titan, but I also, having not seen that, it made me think more of Pacific Rim because there's these Leviathan monsters that come out of the ocean and attack the coast every so often. And I just really loved the sort of darker, grittier aspect of this world building compared with this murder mystery element that is so familiar to me as someone who loves like golden age detective stories. And Sherlock Holmes. I know that Bennett has said that this isn't actually based on Sherlock Holmes. It's based on, I think, the Nero Wolfe mystery series, which I think is where some folks are a little dissatisfied because the dynamic between Din as the assistant and Anna as the investigator is that Anna doesn't go to the crime scenes herself. She actually sends Din, and Din has this magical ability to memorize anything he sees by attaching it to his scent. And then when he smells that again, he can essentially replicate in his mind the entire scene perfectly. And so then she uses that to solve the murder, and that way she never has to go interact with the scene herself. And I just really liked that dynamic. It felt very unusual, and it is unusual if you're expecting more of the Sherlock where they're both investigating the crime scene. I can see where that was a little bit of a letdown for other folks, but I really liked having that sort of different dynamic from what I usually see in mysteries. And Anna is such an over-the-top, prickly kind of... She is like Sherlock Holmes in terms of like the drug use and not having patience for normal people. And I also really liked the way that Bennett celebrated sort of neurospicy folks in this one, because Anna clearly is overwhelmed by dealing with a lot of people. She's sensitive to a lot of things, so she doesn't want to interact with the world that much. She just wants to sit back and sort of gather all of the information without having to dabble in people. And there's also an element too that Din is struggling with that I don't want to spoil because it was such an interesting exploration of it to me. But again, definitely delves into neurospicy, but not in a condescending way, more in like an empowering way that I really appreciated. So again, I could talk about the Tainted Cup all day. It's hands down my favorite fantasy mystery blend, and I'm desperately hoping that Bennett gets to do like 50 more books in this series, because I would eat up literally any more installments of Anna and Din. So I read this in October, and I was absolutely convinced that nothing would be able to beat this as my number one book, because it absolutely blew me away. And I am 100% on the hype train for this book, and I know it is such a hype series. And that is Jade City by Fonda Lee. So I originally picked this up a while back. Like, I want to say it was either at the beginning of this year or last year. Beginning of 2024 or 2023. I do not remember. And I set it down because at the time I did not have enough ability to focus on it, because the characters in this immediately gripped me and they were stressing me out because I knew all kinds of stuff was going to happen that I couldn't handle not being able to just binge my way through this book. So I did wait and until a time where I was unemployed and finally had time to sit down and just binge this, and absolutely fell in love with it. So I can't imagine there are very many people who haven't heard of Jade City at this point. I often hear it compared to Godfather plus like Kung Fu martial arts, and I don't necessarily disagree, but as someone who was never interested in Godfather, and the idea of crime families was never a thing that really drew me, that description kind of put me off on reading this for a while. And for me, this is very much, it is definitely focused on these families that rule this island nation that has recently thrown off its colonial oppressor. And now they're trying to figure out what the power structure is going to be moving into more of a modern age. It definitely has more of like an urban fantasy, almost like post World War II alternate feel to it. Even though it's a totally fantasy world, it just has a lot of those parallels if you're familiar with the history at all. So I thought that was fascinating the way Fonda Lee handled it, and it is focused specifically on one particular family and their dynamics as the power is shifting within that family. So it's very character driven. You follow the different perspectives of the various siblings of the Call family as they're navigating some of the rival clans on this island and the larger political dynamics, which was just really interesting. I think the siblings themselves were fully realized. I loved the complicated dynamics between them, between Shay and Hilo in particular. There's this rivalry, but also love for each other that they're constantly having to navigate, and not really being able to see eye to eye, but still having that sibling bond was just so well done. I honestly don't think I've seen anybody write characters more compelling than Fonda Lee. So on a character level, Jade City really blew me away, and the intrigue was so fascinating to me. The villain in this is really intriguing. It really gets into sort of the different levels of patriarchy, and not only how it affects the women in the story, but also how it affects the men, and forces them to maybe take on more than they can really handle. And sort of the tragedy of that was just so fascinating to see Fonda Lee navigate. Again, I keep gushing about this, and I get for some folks where this is maybe a little slower, maybe not as interesting, but if you really identify and get wrapped up in character work, I really think you should give this a shot if you haven't already. I did not get around to the sequels in 2024, so I will definitely be picking them up again in 2025. It is going to be a priority series for me, and I can't wait to see. I both can't wait to see where Fonda takes this, but also am terrified to see where Fonda takes this. So I'll definitely be finishing probably within the first half of the year. So 2024 was definitely the year for me to finish some series that I knew I had loved, but just somehow never got around to reading the sequels. And this duology in particular is one that the first book blew me away. I absolutely loved it, and then I was so scared to pick up the sequel because I was so afraid it wouldn't live up to how much I loved the first book. And that is A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine. This is incredible. This is, bar none, the best sequel I have ever read, and fully cemented the Teixcalan duology as a favorite series of all time. I was just absolutely blown away by how well Arkady Martine took the themes from A Memory Called Empire and really drew them out and expanded the perspectives and really sort of delved into both the glories and the dangers of Teixcalan as an empire and its impact on everything around it. It's just masterfully done. I don't know if anything else that Martine writes is going to measure up to how much I love this series, which is the danger, but I'll still probably pick up anything she writes. I can't really talk about the plot in this one without spoiling things from A Memory Called Empire. So I'll just, like I said, it expands on a lot of the themes from that one. It is sci-fi, much more of a space opera. In this one, with elements of First Contact, that's handled really interestingly. The perspectives expand beyond just Mahit, the ambassador from the first book, into a number of different characters who are in various levels of the Teixcalan Empire, and a couple outside perspectives just to give you that outside view. It is really interesting to see how this changed your perspective on the Empire because you were seeing more pieces of it than just the outsider barbarian looking in. And it still really dwelt a lot on themes of language and imperialism and how the Empire responds to conflict in different ways. It really digs into Mahit's character journey and how she's simultaneously too barbarian for the Empire, but too Teixcalan for her own culture, the Stationers. And just the dynamic of that was so fascinating to see her navigate, especially as she loves both of these places and doesn't know where she fits in anymore. And honestly, I just love Arkady Martine's writing and theme work. I just gushed about this probably too much at this point, but if you like sci-fi space opera, especially more thematically driven, I really cannot recommend this series highly enough. It is definitely a favorite for me, and I can see myself picking this up and rereading this duology on a regular basis, just because, I mean, the amount of tabs I put in this book is absurd, and I know I'll want to revisit them. So that was my list of my top 10 books from 2024. I love all of these so much. It was honestly difficult for me to narrow down what was going to be on this list because I had a great reading year. And I'm really hoping I'll find as many 5-star new favorites in 2025. But I feel blessed to have had the reading year that I had in 2024. Let me know what your favorites of the year were. Let me know if you have read any of the books that I talked about and what your thoughts were, even if you don't love them as much as I do. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.